Chapter 8 of The Adventures of a Bear, and a Great Bear, too. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of a Bear, and a Great Bear, too, by Alfred Elwes. At rest. It is not easy to say how long Bruin remained insensible, but it must have been some time, for when he recovered himself, there was a feeling of weakness about him, as though he had been fasting long. His head, too, felt sadly dizzy as he rose from his cold bed and pushed his nose against the hole of a window to procure a little air. From this he withdrew to pace his narrow cell, and, as the turning round increased his giddiness, on reaching the opposite wall, he retraced his step backwards, and so continued for a full hour, gently moving his head meanwhile to the right and left, as was his wont. Then, getting into the driest corner, he threw himself of a heap on the ground, and mechanically resuming the old family practice of sucking his paw, tried to bring his mind to bear upon his situation. But this was a matter of no little difficulty, for the late events of his life had tended, very considerably, to weaken an intellect that was never remarkable for strength. And so he sat, and relapsed into a dozy state, where forgetfulness, for the most part, presided. At times, it is true, he would wake up, and the old fire lighting in his eyes, he would dash his paw on the ground as he observed the prison walls close around him. But the feeling was momentary, and it was evident that the indulgence of his evil passions had so far clouded his reason that a few weeks' solitary confinement would deprive him of all power of reflection forever. Evening had come again, though it was dark night in Bruin's cell, and had been so for hours, when suddenly he heard, or fancied he heard, his name uttered in a loud whisper. A fear he had never before experienced, an apprehension of he knew not what, stole over him, and it was not till the voice, a little louder, exclaimed, "Bruin! Bruin, I say!" that he dared venture a reply, when, after an effort, he said, "Who calls?" "A friend," was the ready answer. "A friend!" exclaimed Bruin savagely. "Then you can't be seeking me, for I've got no friends." "Come, come, Bruin," said the voice again. "Don't be testy. It's I, the captain, and you know I never played you false." Bruin now, indeed, recognized the voice as that of, perhaps, the most desperate dog in Caneville. He was a bloodhound of large size and formidable strength, and such ferocity and daring that few cared to come into contact with him, lest, by some chance, they should be involved in a quarrel, which could only have a disastrous termination. Public report fixed more than one deep crime upon this canine desperado, but still, somehow, he escaped the power of the law. Bruin felt flattered at his attention, and inquired what had brought him there. "Why," replied the captain, "this is the third time I have been here already, but though I have called out your name so loudly that I expected to alarm the guard, I have got no answer till tonight. I shouldn't have come back again, for I thought you were dead." "So I have been nearly, captain," answered Bruin, "but I am not quite gone yet, you hear. Now you have found me alive, though, what is it you want, and how can I, shut up here, be of any interest to you?" "Listen to me, Bruin," said the captain, as he squeezed his nose into the tiny window, and dropped his voice to a low whisper. "If you were out, and at liberty, would you feel inclined to join me and one or two others in a job we intend to come off tonight?" Bruin hastened to reply, but the captain interrupted him, saying, "Don't be in a hurry to make a promise until you know what it is, for, shut up here as you are, you can't betray the secret if you would, so I don't mind revealing it. 4 of us mean to break into old Lord Greyhound's house tonight, where we hear there's money enough to enrich us for our lives. But, as we're likely to have some hard work and stout resistance, and think we are not strong enough yet for the business, we should like you to join us if you choose to do so." Bruin reflected a moment, where reflection was ruin. Had he, at once, and scornfully rejected the horrible temptation, there would still have been hope for him. But, besides the prospect of liberty, though he did not yet know how that was to be effected, there was the chance of enriching himself once again, and, above all, There was a prospect of revenge against a dog who had once sought his life because he had been selected as an object of preference by his daughter. His meditations, therefore, were at once brought to an end by his resolution to accept the proposal. But before he did so, the caution he had acquired by associating with such beasts as the captain made him say, "Let us understand each other clearly. You said just now, 'If I were out and at liberty,' have you, then, the power to set me free?" "Provided you will be of the party and agree to our terms," answered the captain. "And how if I refuse?" pursued Bruin. "Why," replied the captain quickly and ferociously, "you'll stop there till you starve." "I accept your offer," said Bruin, after the slightest possible pause, "and I would have done so without the alternative, for private reasons of my own. So let me out, old fellow, as fast as you like." "And you give your word?" said the captain. "The word of a bear," replied Bruin. The other exclaimed, "All right! I shall see you again in half an hour." Never did half an hour seem so long. As minute after minute flew by, there broke upon Bruin's misty brain a notion that, perhaps, this was only a trick of the captain's to get him to declare his willingness to join any desperate deed in order to ruin him. But then, again, he could discover no reason for such enmity, and could see no advantage accruing to that individual by such a course. At the very idea, however, of such betrayal, his teeth gnashed together, his eyes glared in the darkness like two live coals, and he involuntarily crossed his huge paws over his chest, as though hugging some imaginary enemy. But he recovered his self-possession on hearing a grating noise at the other side of the cell, which gradually became louder, until at last a gust of air, which revived his spirits, came whistling round the vault and told that his path was open. The captain, too, was in an instant by his side to confirm it. He passed through an aperture, caused by an open iron door, preceded by his companion, who had, however, first cautiously reclosed and fastened up the secret entrance, and as they traversed a damp and dark tunnel, the captain explained the mystery by saying this place had been known to him some time, though it was unsuspected by the authorities, and that the exterior entrance was so covered up by brambles that no one, ignorant of the spot, could ever imagine what lay behind, or would care to explore the threatening passage, if by any chance they discovered it. As Bruin was exhausted for want of food, and it still wanted some hours of the time appointed for their undertaking, they proceeded to one of the old resorts, and regaled most heartily the sense of liberty after his confinement, raising the bear's spirits to the highest pitch. At length the time agreed on arrived, and the party, prepared for their desperate and wicked undertaking, set out. It has been mentioned in a previous part of this history that Lord Greyhound was one of the principal grandees in Caneville, both as regarded fortune and family, and that he lived in a palace befitting his condition. A crowd of domestics belonged to his household, but the captain was aware that their cribs were remote, and that but little in the shape of resistance was to be feared from them, should they be aroused. Still, great caution was requisite, for if they did not bite, they could bark, and that would be equally as fatal to their success on this occasion. The only difficulty to be got over was the vigilance of a porter who slept below, whose fidelity to his master had been tried on more than one occasion, although what made such attachment singular in this instance was the fact that the said porter was one of the feline tribe, a cat, in fact, of large dimensions, and peculiarly savage nature. Bruin, however, took upon himself the task of quieting this servant and keeping watch below, whilst the others should ransack the mansion, a place of rendezvous being appointed where they were to meet in case of alarm. To avoid suspicion, they proceeded alone to the scene of their intended crime, and, favored by darkness, they reached it unchallenged. Having gently tried the fastenings in one or two places, they resolved to make the attempt at a small door at the back, which seemed the most weakly guarded. Bruin pushed it first quietly with his huge shoulder, and, finding it gradually yielding, without further ado, he placed his knee against the lower panel, and with less noise than might have been expected, sent the door flying from its fastenings. He was the first to enter, though the others were close behind, but he had not taken 2 steps within the house than he saw, as he thought, 2 balls of fire on the floor before him. It was his last look of worldly things, for, at the same moment, the porter cat, for it was he, sprang at the huge giant like a fury, and dug his long and pointed talons into Bruin's eyes. With a howl so dreadful, so awful in its intense agony and rage, that it seemed to spring from a supernatural source, the affrighted beast rolled over and over in his pain, crushing the cat to death in his struggles. Then feeling, even amidst his suffering, the necessity of safety, he rose to his feet, and ran on, he knew not whither, till he felt himself in the midst of water, and heard the rushing which it made. So instantaneous had been the whole transaction, that the truth was never rightly known. The family, nay, the neighbourhood, aroused by the horrid noise, rushed to the spot, to find the faithful porter dead, with every bone shattered. The door was open, but no creature was there to tell the tale. One alone suspected it, one to whom that cry of agony was a death blow. For, 2 days after the event, the Honourable Miss Greyhound slept with her fathers, the victim of a misplaced and unworthy attachment. And Bruin, where was he? Alas, poor beast! 3 days after this event, he was discovered by the authorities, half dead with pain, and led back to prison, which he had left with so little ceremony. His senses, however, were so bewildered by his situation, that he could neither explain how he had escaped from his dungeon, nor the cause of his present deplorable condition. Perhaps, too, he deemed it more prudent to be silent on both these matters. His judges, nevertheless, taking into consideration his now helpless state, and rightly thinking his powers of mischief were much abated by the loss of his eyes, pardoned his previous offence, and thrust him, alone and helpless, on the world. For many a long year did the ill-fated animal drag on his wearisome existence, living on the charity, the scanty charity, of Caneville. Deprived of sight, no longer able to acquire a livelihood by his labour, weary and full of remorse, he daily took his round through the public streets, soliciting a penny for the poor blind. A dog, induced for a weekly trifle, and the prospect of an extra bone or 2 thrown to him, sometimes by the compassionate, as they went their melancholy way, led him in his wanderings. At first, however, either from ignorance or carelessness, or a currish malice, he would often guide his helpless master into positions of difficulty and danger, from which he could scarce have extricated himself but for the assistance of some benevolent passers-by. Though his situation, in such cases, be it said to the shame of the inferior population of Caneville, too often excited derision and laughter, instead of aid and consolation. Once, indeed, he was seriously hurt by the wilful inattention of his guide. For, tottering along as usual one fine morning with his staff in one hand, the string attached to the dog's collar in the other, and his head with the sightless eyes raised sadly in the air, whilst he uttered his plaintive cry of, "Have pity on the poor blind!" The last word was suddenly converted from a doleful whine to a howl of pain, as his body came in contact with a post, which stood right across his path. Time, which cures all things, brought, at last, an effectual remedy to his sufferings, and that remedy was death. Ere that great foe or friend relieved poor Bruin, he had learnt to be repentant of his former life, and was often known to reprove in others any tendency to those faults of temper or disposition which had been his own ruin. If he could have recovered the use of his eyes, and have mingled once more with the business of life, it is a question whether he would have acted up to the precepts which he now inculcated. But, as the experiment was never tried, nor could be, it is but charitable to think the best. Months after he had departed this sinful world, a sturdy traveller, with a particularly wide mouth and short address, entered the city of Caneville. He stated that he was a native of the place, and had been wandering far away in other lands. He made various inquiries concerning former inhabitants of the town, and among others asked for Bruin. His life, much as I have recounted it, was told to him, and long did the stranger ruminate over the details. Many portions of it were, indeed, known to him, for the traveler was no other than our old acquaintance, Tom. But all was interesting. When he had heard it to the end, he uttered these only words, which might, indeed, serve for moral in poor Bruin's epitaph. Ah, he was a great bear! End of chapter 8, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, December 26, 2022. End of the Adventures of a Bear, and a Great Bear Too, by Alfred Elwes.